Welcome to the world behind midnight, where darkness reveals what daylight hides. Tonight, a truth buried in classified files. They briefed us. It was a standard perimeter assignment. 4 nights watching a restricted zone deep in the Montana wilderness. What nobody mentioned was that we weren't the guards. We were the observed. Something in those woods had been watching soldiers for decades, learning our patterns, mimicking our voices, testing the barriers we pretended could hold it. By the time we understood what lived beyond that fence, it was already too late to leave unchanged. This is the account they ordered us to bury. This is why some military zones stay restricted forever. The convoy rolled through Checkpoint Zulu at 1400 hours, pushing deeper into wilderness that felt wrong from the first mile. Corporal Daniels drove our transport, while I rode passenger, scanning forests so dense the afternoon sun barely touched ground. Behind us, Thompson and Hayes sat silent, weapons ready, despite this supposedly being routine observation duty. The Bitterroot Range stretched in every direction, endless pine and granite formations that swallowed radio signals and made even satellite phones unreliable. "Ever done restricted zone duty before?" Daniels asked, hands tight on the wheel as we navigated switchbacks that climbed higher into terrain that civilization had abandoned. I shook my head, watching trees press closer to the access road, their shadows thick and deliberate. 4 days of perimeter watch around some training area, they said. Log activity, maintain radio contact every 6 hours, keep unauthorized civilians away from the fence line. Simple enough that they didn't need experienced personnel, or so the briefing officer had claimed, with a face that gave nothing away. The restricted zone appeared around a final curve, and my stomach dropped without clear reason. 12-foot chain link topped with fresh razor wire. Warning signs every 15 yards screaming danger and authorized access only, and lethal force authorized. But the forest beyond looked untouched. No scorched earth from explosives testing. No impact craters. No shell casings scattered in the pine needles. Just fence and warnings like someone had decided this land needed to look dangerous without bothering to make it actually look used. "Those signs are brand new," Thompson observed from the back seat, voice carrying an edge I'd heard before in men who trusted their instincts more than their orders. "Paint's still bright. But look at the fence posts, rust patterns that take years to develop. This zone's been here a long time." Daniels cut the engine at the staging area. A small clearing with 3 prefab observation posts spaced evenly around the southern perimeter. Standard equipment, standard layout, nothing suggesting anything other than boring routine work ahead. But as we unloaded our gear and the forest settled into late afternoon quiet, that wrongness in my gut sharpened into something more specific. Silence. Complete and absolute silence where there should have been bird calls, insect noise, the rustle of small animals moving through underbrush. Just heavy waiting quiet that made my pulse loud in my own ears and triggered warnings my training couldn't explain. Staff Sergeant Voss emerged from the command post, a man in his late 40s with gray, threading his temples and eyes that had seen too much of something he couldn't discuss. "Welcome to Zone 7, he said, voice flat and professionally neutral. "Standard rotation protocol applies. Maintain visual observation of the fence line. Log any activity. Radio check every 6 hours on the hour. You do not approach the barrier under any circumstances. You do not investigate sounds or movement beyond the perimeter. You observe, you document, you report, nothing more." Hayes stepped forward, young and eager, and not yet understanding when to keep questions unasked. "Sarge, what exactly are we observing for?" The briefing mentioned wildlife management, but this seems like pretty serious security for keeping deer out. Voss's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that made my skin prickle. "You observe whatever appears in your sector, and you log it according to protocol. The nature of potential contacts has been deemed need to know, above your clearance level." That was the moment I should have demanded better answers, should have refused the assignment, until someone explained why a wildlife management zone needed razor wire and armed guards and protocols that restricted our own movement. But soldiers follow orders even when those orders smell wrong, so I shouldered my pack and headed to my assigned post without further questions. Night fell fast in the mountains, swallowing the weak daylight in great hungry gulps until nothing remained but our night vision equipment, turning the world shades of green. I settled into observation, post 2, checking my rifle for the dozenth time and scanning the fence line that stretched away into darkness on both sides. The forest pressed close beyond the barrier, walls of lodgepole pine, creating shadows deeper than normal darkness should allow. My watch read 2,100 hours when I first noticed the smell. It came on still air like a physical presence, thick and cloying animal musk, mixed with something sharper that coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. Not the clean scent of deer or elk, something ranker, more aggressive, marking territory in a way that triggered every primitive alarm system in my hindbrain screaming predator nearby. I keyed my radio with hands that wanted to shake. Post 2 to command, detecting strong animal scent, northwest quadrant. Unknown source. Static crackled before Voss responded, voice carefully controlled. Acknowledged post 2. Maintain observation position. Do not investigate. This is normal for the area. Normal. The word hung in my mind like a lie nobody bothered to make convincing. The footsteps started around midnight, heavy and deliberate in the underbrush beyond the fence. Not the random movement of animals foraging or traveling, but purposeful circling that suggested whatever made those sounds was studying our perimeter, learning our layout, counting our positions. Sometimes the steps were measured in upright heel-toe rhythm that spoke to bipedal locomotion, weight distribution that suggested something walking on two legs with the confidence of long practice. Then the pattern would shift mid-stride, becoming broader and faster, quadrupedal movement that covered ground with explosive speed, before shifting back again to that unsettling two-legged gait. Command, post 3, Hayes reported, voice tight. I'm tracking movement in my sector, approximately 30 meters beyond the fence. Gait pattern is inconsistent, shifting between what sounds like bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion. Request permission to use thermal imaging to identify. Voss's response came quick and sharp. Negative post 3. Maintain passive observation only. Do not activate thermal or spotlight systems. Do not attempt to identify the source. The circling continued for another hour, that impossible shifting gait, moving around the entire perimeter in a pattern too deliberate to be random, wandering. It was mapping us, I realized with ice forming in my stomach. Learning where each post was positioned, how many soldiers were present, what our fields of fire looked like. Intelligence gathering by something that shouldn't possess intelligence. Then came the sounds that made my finger freeze on the trigger and my breath stop in my throat. Low rumbling that started as pure animal growl, the kind that comes from a chest too large to comprehend, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. But as it stretched and sustained, the tone warped, rising in pitch and taking on inflections that were almost articulated, almost shaped like words being formed by a throat that wasn't built for human speech, but was trying anyway. The vocalization lasted maybe 10 seconds, impossible seconds that violated every natural law I thought I understood, before cutting off into silence, so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Did you hear that?" Thompson whispered over the radio, fear leaking through his normally steady voice. "That wasn't any animal I've ever encountered. That sounded almost like it was trying to talk." Radio silence. Voss barked, but I heard the strain in his command. The barely controlled panic of a man confronting something he'd hoped would stay dormant for just one more rotation. All positions maintain radio silence unless under direct threat. Observe only. I sat in that silence for the next 3 hours, rifle gripped so tight my hands cramped, staring at the fence line and trying to convince myself that what I'd heard could be explained by wind or acoustic tricks, or anything other than the truth my gut was screaming. But I'd been a soldier too long to lie to myself about real danger versus imagined threats. Dawn came with no bird song, no insect chorus, no sound of forest waking to greet the sun. Just gray light filtering through perpetual overcast that turned the world colorless and dead. We assembled for morning briefing, looking like survivors of heavy combat. Red-rimmed eyes and hands shaking from adrenaline that had never found proper release. Voss stood before us with a face carved from stone, jaw clenched tight around words he clearly didn't want to say. Last night's activity has been logged and reported to command per standard protocol. We will continue observation duties for the remaining 3 nights of this rotation. All personnel are reminded that investigation of sounds or movement beyond the fence line is strictly prohibited. You will maintain your positions, document any anomalous activity in your sector logs, and under no circumstances will you approach the barrier or attempt direct engagement with wildlife in the area. Daniel stepped forward, anger overriding his usual deference to rank. Sarge, with all respect, that wasn't normal wildlife activity. Whatever's out there was circling our positions in a deliberate pattern, making vocalizations that sounded like attempted speech. We have a right to know what we're actually dealing with. Voss's expression remained neutral, but his eyes carried a weight that spoke to years of watching soldiers ask the same questions and receiving the same known answers. Your right is to follow orders and complete your assigned rotation. The nature of fauna in this restricted zone is classified above your clearance level and mine. We observe, we document, we maintain the perimeter. That is the extent of our operational authority. After the briefing, I volunteered for perimeter patrol, because sitting still felt impossible when my mind kept replaying those sounds, kept hearing that almost human inflection in a growl that should have been purely animal. Thompson joined me without being asked, both of us needing to move and do something that felt like taking action, even if it changed nothing. We followed the service road that circled the exclusion zone, boots crunching on gravel in a silence so oppressive it made normal sounds feel like violations. The fence ran 10 yards to our right, chain link topped with razor wire that gleamed in the weak morning light like teeth waiting to bite. Halfway around the northern section, Thompson grabbed my arm and pointed without speaking. The mud alongside the road was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding impressions, and what I saw there made my stomach drop and my worldview crack. Tracks everywhere, dozens of them crisscrossing the area in patterns that made no sense according to any zoology I'd ever studied. They were massive, 18 inches from heel to toe, but the shape violated normal predator morphology in ways that made my brain struggle to process what my eyes were seeing. Some prints showed clear heel strikes, deep and deliberate, with toe impressions that suggested bipedal weight distribution, something walking upright on 2 legs with confidence and balance. Others were broader and splayed, claws dug deep into earth. Quadrupedal prints from something that had dropped to all 4s for speed or stability before rising again to walk upright. What the hell alternates between walking and running on 4 legs? Thompson whispered, crouching beside the clearest prints and holding his hand next to them for scale. His palm barely covered half the width. I knelt down, studying the tracks with growing horror as the implications settled into my mind like stones sinking into dark water. The stride length varied wildly, here bipedal with human-like spacing, there quadrupedal with the explosive reach of a predator in full sprint, then back to 2-legged movement that suggested something comfortable and practiced in upright locomotion. Not an animal that occasionally reared up on hind legs, but something that moved between forms with equal ease, like watching a creature that couldn't decide what it was, or something that was deliberately both. "We need to photograph these," Thompson said, pulling out his phone before I caught his wrist and stopped him. "No documentation beyond standard logs," I heard myself saying, echoing Voss's restrictions without fully understanding why they existed. "We observe and report verbal description only." Thompson stared at me with wide eyes that reflected my own fear back at me. "This is evidence of an unknown species, possibly a significant biological discovery. We can't just ignore physical proof that something out here is moving in ways that shouldn't be possible. But we could ignore it, because acknowledging those tracks meant admitting what made them, meant following that truth wherever it led, and I wasn't ready to walk that path yet." We found more tracks as we completed the circuit, all following the fence line in patterns that showed hours of methodical circling, testing and examining and learning the layout with purpose that suggested planning capability. Some prints were pressed so deep into the mud that the weight required must have been enormous. 500 pounds minimum, distributed across a frame built for power and endurance and violence. Should we collect casts? Thompson asked, protocol warring with the fear in his voice. Send samples to a lab for analysis and identification. The sensible part of me wanted to say yes, wanted to follow proper field procedure and document everything according to the training that had been drilled into us from day one. But something deeper, something primal, warned me that drawing official attention to these tracks would invite questions nobody wanted answered, would open doors that needed to stay closed, would acknowledge truths that Command had spent decades keeping classified. No, I said finally, standing and backing away from the evidence like it might contaminate me through proximity. We log the observation and continue patrol. Nothing more. As we walked back toward the staging area, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere in that silent forest something was observing us walk the same path it had walked, marked the same territory it had marked hours before, and it knew we'd found its tracks and was deciding what that discovery meant. Night 2 descended like a sentence being carried out, darkness swallowing the world faster than seemed natural, while we took our positions with hands that trembled despite our best efforts at control. The breathing started earlier this time, barely 2 hours after full dark, coming from multiple positions around the perimeter, in a pattern that suggested coordination and communication between separate entities. Heavy and rhythmic, deliberate inhalations that carried across still air, with the wet rasp of air moving through passages too large for any normal predator. Multiple contacts, I reported into the radio, forcing my voice steady through sheer will. Northwest, northeast, and southeast quadrants. Audio signatures consistent with large predators. Pattern suggests coordinated movement. No response from Voss, just static and the sound of his breathing. Shallow and quick, like a man barely holding panic at bay. The sounds moved closer, approaching the fence line with confidence they'd lacked the previous night. Heavy footfalls in underbrush that snapped branches and crushed vegetation, sometimes bipedal and sometimes quadrupedal, shifting between forms with fluid ease that made my skin crawl. They were getting bolder, getting comfortable with our presence, treating us like fixtures of the landscape, rather than threats to be avoided. Then came the vocalizations that made every muscle in my body lock up tight. It started in Hayes's sector, low rumbling that built into something between howl and roar, sustaining at a pitch that made my ears ache and my vision blur. But underneath that animal sound, woven through it like thread through fabric, were other tones. Inflections and patterns that sounded almost like speech, like words being shaped by a throat that wasn't designed for human language, but was attempting it anyway, forcing syllables through anatomy that resisted every effort. And it was trying. That was the worst part. Deliberately attempting communication, rather than just making noise. Testing its ability to produce human phonemes, and learning from each attempt how to improve the next one. A second voice answered from my sector, maybe 40 yards beyond the fence. Lighter in tone, but carrying that same impossible mix of animal and almost human vocalization. The two voices called back and forth, and I swear to whatever higher power exists. It sounded like conversation, like information being exchanged in a language that used growls and warped syllables instead of words but followed patterns of call and response that suggested meaning and intent. They're talking to each other. Hayes breathed into the radio, wonder mixing with terror in his voice. Command, these things are actually communicating in some kind of language. Radio silence. Voss snapped, voice cracking halfway through the order. All positions ceased transmission, unless under immediate attack. But the damage was done, the truth spoken aloud, and impossible to take back. We were dealing with something that thought and planned and communicated with its own kind. The voices continued for another 15 minutes, moving around the perimeter in what felt like a deliberate demonstration of their numbers and coordination. Sometimes close enough that I could hear the wet rasp of breathing between vocalizations. The sound of massive lungs working to produce sounds that violated every rule of animal vocalization. Then they stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the sounds had been. because now I knew they were out there watching and listening and learning our patterns just as we tried futilely to learn theirs. Around 0200 hours, something new happened that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. A single voice, very close to my position, maybe 20 feet beyond the fence, spoke in broken and guttural syllables that my brain struggled to process as language. But I recognized the cadence, the specific rhythm and pitch, the exact pattern of speech. It was mimicking my voice, playing back something I'd said on the radio hours earlier, repeating my words through a throat that had been close enough to hear, not just the transmission, but my actual voice. Close enough to study how I formed sounds, and now demonstrating it could reproduce them. The message was unmistakable and terrifying. I heard you, I learned from you. I could sound like you if I chose to, and you never knew I was close enough to study you that intimately. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. None of us did. We stayed at our posts gripping weapons that felt increasingly inadequate, listening to occasional movement in darkness and trying not to think about what kind of intelligence it took to mimic human speech, to coordinate with others of your kind, to study prey before deciding whether to attack. When dawn finally came, gray and weak and offering no comfort, we emerged from our positions hollow-eyed and shaking with the exhaustion that comes from flooding your system with adrenaline for 8 straight hours without finding release. The fence looked undamaged, wire intact, and posts standing firm. But something had changed during the night. Some invisible boundary had been crossed that we couldn't name, but could all feel pressing down on our shoulders like physical weight. "How many of them are there?" Daniels asked during morning briefing, directing the question at Voss with the kind of directness that comes from fear overriding military protocol. "How many of these things are we actually dealing with?" Voss stared at him for a long moment before responding, and in his eyes I saw knowledge he wished he didn't possess, truth that had cost him something essential to learn. Observation data suggests 3 to 5 individuals, all adult, all fully capable of coordinated action and communication. But the exact number is classified above my authority level, and frankly above my desire to know more than absolutely necessary for completing rotations safely. That afternoon, while trying unsuccessfully to rest, I kept seeing those tracks in the mud. The way they shifted from bipedal to quadrupedal and back again with ease, that suggested something caught between forms. Something that was somehow both wolf and something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. The third night descended with the weight of inevitability. Darkness coming too fast and lasting too long while we took positions with the mechanical precision of condemned men going through motions, because orders said so, but knowing something fundamental had shifted. The creature arrived early, before full darkness, before we'd even activated night vision equipment. Just appeared at the fence line in the western sector where Hayes was posted, standing upright in the failing light like it wanted to be seen clearly for the first time. "Contact. Western perimeter," Hayes reported, voice admirably steady, despite the shake I could hear underneath. "Visual confirmation. Subject is approximately 7 feet tall, bipedal stance, observing our position from 10 meters beyond the fence. Through my scope, I could just make out the shape across the clearing. Massive silhouette standing motionless, with arms hanging at its sides, head turned directly toward Hayes's post, in a posture that radiated intelligence and calculation, watching and waiting, and studying us with clear deliberate intent. It stood there for 5 eternal minutes, long enough for all of us to get a clear look through our optics, long enough to cement every impossible detail into memory, long enough to understand that what we were seeing couldn't be explained away or rationalized or dismissed. Then it moved, not away but toward the fence, step by measured step, two-legged and confident, closing the distance with purpose that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The chain link sang with tension as it approached, metal vibrating with sympathetic resonance, as if the fence itself could sense the predator testing its limits. 10 feet away, 5 feet, 3, it stopped just outside arm's reach of the wire, towering over the barrier that suddenly looked pathetically inadequate for containing something of this size and obvious power. This close, even in fading light, I could see details through my scope that made my stomach clench and my worldview shatter. The fur wasn't uniform, patches matted with old blood and dirt. Other sections showing scarring underneath where old wounds had healed into raised tissue that spoke to a history of violence and survival against things that should have killed it. Its breathing was audible even from my position 40 yards away. Deep, regular inhalations that expanded a chest broader than any bear's, speaking to lung capacity and endurance that exceeded any normal mammalian parameters. The smell rolled off it in waves strong enough to make my eyes water from this distance. Thick musk that marked territory and asserted dominance through scent alone, claiming this space as its own and us as temporary intruders it was choosing to tolerate. Then it reached out one massive hand, and I watched through magnified optics as claws longer than my fingers gripped the fence and dug into supposedly secure links. The entire section vibrated, singing with tension as those claws found purchase and began to pull, gently at first, experimentally, testing how much pressure the barrier could take before failing. The fence bowed inward under that casual strength, military-grade security designed to stop vehicles deforming like tissue paper under a pull that wasn't even straining, wasn't exerting real effort, just exploring limits with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. "Hold fire," Voss barked into the radio, anticipating what we were all thinking, fingers tightening on triggers and safeties coming off. "Nobody shoots unless I give explicit authorization." The creature released its grip, and the fence snapped back with a twang that echoed across the clearing, metal singing its distress and inadequacy. For a moment, it just stood there contemplating what it had learned about our defenses and finding them wanting. Then it counted us. I don't know how else to describe what I witnessed through my scope. The head turning slowly and deliberately from position to position, pausing at each observation post long enough to lock eyes with whoever was stationed there before moving on to the next. 1, 2, 3, 4, taking inventory, assessing numbers, calculating odds with the kind of tactical evaluation that spoke to intelligence and strategic thinking. And I understood with horrifying certainty that this wasn't mindless beast operating on instinct. This was conscious analysis by something that understood numerical advantage and the value of reconnaissance before committing to action, something that thought and planned like we did but with advantages we couldn't match. It looked directly at me across 40 yards of clearing, and our eyes met through the scope's magnification. Gold and green burning with intelligence that felt like physical impact, like being evaluated and measured and categorized as threat or prey or something in between. For 3 heartbeats it held my gaze, and in that locked moment I felt certain it could see through the darkness and the optics and the distance. Could see me as clearly as I saw it, could remember my face and scent and position for future reference. Then without breaking eye contact it opened its mouth and made a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Low and controlled with almost conversational tone. Not quite roar and not quite growl, but something in between that carried meaning. I couldn't parse but could feel in my bones. A declaration of presence and power, an absolute confidence in its own supremacy over everything in this valley. Then it dropped to all fours. The transformation so fast my eyes barely tracked the movement, and exploded into motion with speed that violated physics and common sense. One instant standing at the fence, the next vanished into the tree line so completely it might never have existed, moving with velocity that's something that massive shouldn't possess, covering ground faster than my brain could process. Seconds later, something slammed into the northern fence with devastating force. The entire section shuddering under impact hard enough to make the ground vibrate beneath my boots. Then the eastern perimeter, same massive collision, metal screaming its protest. Then southern, it was circling the entire zone in seconds, hitting each section hard enough to bend steel, proving beyond any doubt that staying contained was choice it made, rather than limitation we enforced. The final impact came from my sector, so close and sudden I didn't have time to track it. Just boom, and the fence section buckling inward. Support posts groaning in concrete footings that suddenly seemed criminally inadequate. And for one terrible instant, I saw it there inches from the wire, chest heaving and steam rising from its massive frame in the cold mountain air. We locked eyes again, and this time I saw something in that inhuman gaze worse than hunger or rage. I saw recognition, knowledge that it had memorized my face and sent in position, would remember me if we ever met again beyond the dubious protection of this fence. Then it was gone, vanishing into darkness so complete it might have been swallowed by the forest itself, leaving only the echo of impacts and the singing of tortured metal. All positions report status, Voss ordered, voice hollow and defeated. One by one we checked in, positions secure but barely, fence held but only just. Understanding finally settling over us that we weren't guards, we were witnesses to something the military had known about for decades. Something they'd built this entire zone to contain but couldn't actually control. The fourth night came too fast, darkness swallowing daylight before we were ready. Before we'd processed what we'd seen, before we'd come to terms with the knowledge that something impossible existed, and we were responsible for pretending barriers could hold it. It arrived with full dark, the sound of heavy breathing circling our positions in patterns that had become almost familiar. Multiple sources coordinating movement in ways that proved intelligence and communication and planning capability. Then came the voice that made my hands shake on my rifle and my breath catch in my throat. Perfect recreation of Voss's command voice, not broken or distorted. Flawless mimicry that would have fooled someone not paying close attention. Maintain position, do not engage, it said from darkness beyond the fence. Playing back our own protocols in tone and inflection that shouldn't be possible from a throat that wasn't human. It had been practicing, listening to our radio traffic and refining its mimicry in the hours between our shifts, learning how to sound like us with precision that opened terrifying possibilities for infiltration and deception, and separating prey from the safety of the group. Haze broke first around 0230 hours, 3.5 hours before scheduled extraction. His nerve failing under 5 days of accumulated terror and sleeplessness and watching something impossible test our defenses while command told us to observe and document, but never engage. A branch snapped directly behind his position, too close and too heavy. The sound of significant weight breaking wood that shouldn't support anything larger than raccoons. Hayes spun with finger, already on trigger, all his training drowning under animal terror of knowing something massive was feet away in darkness. Contact rear, he screamed into the radio, shattering our silence protocol. Something's right behind me. And then he fired, muzzle flash lighting the clearing like lightning. 3 round bursts, stitching through darkness, tracers painting orange lines into forest. The sound of resistance and defiance, and refusing to die quietly, echoing across the valley. The sound of terrible mistake being made in real time. The forest exploded with roar of pure fury that seemed to come from the earth itself. Not pain or fear, but rage at being challenged, at having territory violated with hostile action, at being shot at by prey that should know better. And then it charged. The fence section nearest Hayes, screaming as something massive slammed into it with the force of a truck. Metal shrieking and support posts groaning in concrete that suddenly seemed criminally inadequate. Wire stretching and tearing under impact that sent vibrations through ground hard enough to make me stumble 40 yards away. Hold fire. Voss was screaming, but his voice was lost under the sound of destruction, under the roar that kept building and promising violence and death and consequences for our stupidity. The fence bowed inward, the entire section deforming like paper. And in the strobing light of Hayes' continued firing I saw it pressed against the barrier with full weight of its massive body, claws ripping through wire like string, teeth bared in snarl that showed every impossible fang, eyes burning with fury so intense they seemed to generate their own light. It was bigger than I'd realized, so much bigger. 7 feet tall, not capturing the sheer mass and bulk of muscle and bone and primordial power that was currently tearing through our perimeter with casual violence that made our weapons feel like toys in children's hands. The arms were too long, hanging past where knees would be on a human, ending in hands that combined paw and humanoid nightmare with claws as long as my fingers hooked into fence and pulling until wire parted with metallic screams. The head was wrong. Wolf skull stretched and warped over something that wanted to be both predator and something else. Elongated muzzle wet and dark, lips pulled back to show too many teeth in arrangements that suggested omnivorous diet. Something that could eat meat or vegetation or anything else because it had tools for everything. But it was the eyes that locked up my chest and made my heart hammer, reflecting light with luminous quality that painted them gold and green and alien. But behind that reflection was awareness and evaluation and cold assessment that said this. Creature understood exactly what it was looking at and was deciding right now what to do about our transgression. For one frozen instant, it was right there, close enough to smell its breath, hot and rank with old meat, close enough to see patterns in its fur and scars from old fights, close enough to understand that if it wanted us dead, we would already be scattered meat across this clearing. Then slowly, deliberately, it backed away, not retreating but disengaging with careful precision of something that had made its point and saw no need to prove it further. Each step, measured and controlled, claws pulling free from destroyed fence with metallic groans, chest still heaving but rage banking into something colder and more dangerous because this was disciplined anger that remembered and planned and waited for perfect moments. It paused at the tree line, silhouette massive against darkness, and made one final sound that combined growl and almost speech, a statement and warning and promise that we'd crossed a line it would remember. Then it vanished with that characteristic impossible speed, leaving us shaking and staring at fence that now gaped open like wound. Wire hanging in shreds and posts bent at angles that proved it could have breached perimeter any time it wanted, had chosen not to until we provoked it. Report casualties, Voss ordered, voice hollow. None, I managed. It backed off, chose not to come through. I know, he said. And in those two words I heard the weight of years watching soldiers learn this same lesson about mercy and power and things that chose restraint from position of overwhelming advantage. The rest of the night passed in frozen terror, expecting second attack that would teach us consequences of our stupidity. But it never came. The creature had shown us our place and saw no need for further demonstration. Dawn came eventually, gray and offering no comfort. Just weak light, revealing the destroyed section of fence and the tracks pressed deep into mud beyond the barrier. Evidence that it could have come through, but chose not to. That the containment worked only because it allowed it to work. The repair crew arrived 90 minutes later, professional and efficient, replacing the destroyed section with new wire and stronger posts, working in silence with faces carefully blank. The kind of expression that said they'd done this before and would likely do it again. Nobody asking what happened or commenting on claw marks that scored the metal or tufts of dark fur still caught in torn wire. Just fixing the fence and maintaining the illusion that this barrier meant something. Transport arrived precisely at 0600 hours, rolling up with tactical efficiency that suggested drivers wanted in and out fast because they knew what they were collecting. Not just soldiers but witnesses to something impossible. The debrief happened in stages exactly as expected, separation into different rooms, with different interrogators using classic technique for catching inconsistencies. But our testimony wasn't inconsistent because we weren't lying. We'd all seen the same impossible thing and couldn't unsee it, regardless of what anyone wanted. My interrogator was Major Brennan, middle-aged and professional with carefully maintained neutrality that spoke to long practice handling situations exactly like this. Describe what you observed during your posting, he said, pen ready, expression giving nothing away. So I told him everything, the tracks alternating between bipedal and quadrupedal, the vocalizations attempting human speech, the 7-foot figure with claws and teeth and eyes that burned with intelligence, the fence being torn apart like tissue paper, all of it. He wrote it down without comment, like I was describing weather instead of encounter with something that violated basic biology. When I finished, he looked up and asked the question that had been hanging in the air from the start. What conclusion did you reach regarding the nature of this subject? I thought about lying, about qualifying my observations and retreating into comfortable uncertainty. But I was done with comfortable lies that let everyone pretend reality was something it wasn't. It's not human, but it's not entirely animal either, I said carefully. Something that combines physical capabilities of large predator with cognitive abilities that approach or match human intelligence. Something that can walk on 2 legs or 4, that can learn language through observation, that can plan and strategize and make calculated decisions about when to act and when to show restraint. And do you have terminology for what you think you encountered? The word hung there waiting, because there was a word, had always been a word, existed in dozen languages describing something that shouldn't exist, but humans had been seeing and fearing for thousands of years. Werewolf, I said quietly. That's what people would call it if they knew. Not the Hollywood version, but something real and ancient that's learned to survive in spaces civilization doesn't reach. He wrote it down. Actually wrote it down without denial or dismissal. Then closed his notebook and leaned forward with expression hardening. What you've described is classified at highest levels of national security. The restricted zone exists for specific containment purposes, and both zone and protocols depend absolutely on maintaining operational security. You understand this? You mean keeping quiet about it? I said. I mean recognizing that knowledge you possess could cause widespread panic if released carelessly, that the creature's continued cooperation with containment depends partially on it remaining unknown to general public. I mean understanding that every agreement has failure scenarios, but those scenarios require the subject staying unaware of broader military capabilities, and the public staying unaware of its existence. He slid document across the table. Non-disclosure agreement, thick with legal language and threats. You encountered aggressive wildlife during perimeter observation. Large predator species uncertain demonstrated territorial behavior and damaged security fencing before departing. No casualties, no definitive identification. That's the official record. That's the story. I signed because the alternative was court-martial and dishonorable discharge and questions about mental stability that would follow me forever. Signed away my ability to tell truth in exchange for being allowed to go back to normal life and pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. 3 months have passed since extraction. 3 months of therapy sessions that dance around what actually happened. Of nightmares that wake me gasping. Of looking at normal forests and wondering what might be watching from shadows just beyond sight. 3 months of living with knowledge I'm not supposed to have. The zone still exists. I've verified through publicly available satellite imagery, though coordinates never appear on official maps. Roughly circular area of designated wilderness marked restricted for environmental protection and unexploded ordnance hazard. Both technically true. Environment is protected from what lives there. And there's definitely something hazardous in those woods, though it has nothing to do with ordnance. Rotations still cycle through. I've made contact with 2 other soldiers who were stationed there, one 6 months before my posting. Another scheduled to deploy next month. Neither could talk specifics, because we'd all signed the papers. But in their eyes, I saw same knowledge, same weight of having witnessed something that shattered comfortable illusions. How many are there? I'd asked the guy who'd been there 6 months prior, drunk enough to ask questions we shouldn't, sober enough to know better than answer directly. He'd stared into his beer before responding. More than one, less than enough to be sustainable breeding population. They've done studies, tracked movements. Best guess is 3 to 5 individuals, all adults, all fully capable. Capable of what? Of tearing through any barrier we build, of running down any vehicle we could deploy, of killing any soldier or civilian unfortunate enough to encounter them outside the zone. But they don't. They stay contained. They accept the agreement because they're smart enough to know breaking containment would end them. How long has it been going on? That was the question that haunted me, because if you looked at records, really looked and dug through archival material that's been declassified or leaked, you found references going back decades. World War II era reports of unusual predator activity, Cold War surveillance notes about restricted zones being established for reasons that didn't track with official explanations. They're not new discovery, he'd said, leaning closer and dropping his voice. Not recent mutation or escaped experiment. They're old, older than the military, older than this country. They've been out there the whole time, living in places we don't go, surviving in gaps of our awareness. Then why don't more people know? Because knowing would change everything. The comfortable story we tell ourselves about human dominance, about wilderness being tamed and mapped, that story requires certain things to not exist. And when those things insist on existing anyway, The only option is to classify them and make absolutely sure the public never finds out. There are literal monsters in the woods. The guy deploying next month looked haunted before he'd even left. They had briefed him thoroughly, shown him footage from observation posts, explained protocols in detail. He knew what he was walking into, which was somehow worse than going in blind. I keep thinking about the fence, he'd said, how it's not really keeping them in, how it's just marking territory, an agreement that only works if both sides honor it. But for how long? What happens when one decides the agreement doesn't serve their interests anymore? I still check satellite imagery sometimes, late nights, when I can't sleep. The zone is still there, fence line visible as thin scar through forest, and in spaces between trees, in shadows darker than they should be. I sometimes imagine I can see movement, can see eyes reflecting light that shouldn't reach them, watching the cameras that watch them, learning even now how to better navigate the human world they've chosen to stay hidden from. The paperwork says this is classified, says I'm forbidden from discussing operational details, says violation could result in criminal prosecution. But paperwork doesn't say I can't remember, can't think about it, can't lie awake, knowing the maps we trust are incomplete. That wilderness we think we've tamed still holds secrets we've decided are safer left hidden. Can't wonder what happens when next rotation encounters those tracks, and hears those sounds, and sees those eyes burning with terrible intelligence. Can't stop knowing that somewhere in the Montana wilderness something that shouldn't exist continues existing anyway. Contained but never controlled, observed but never understood, surviving in careful space between acknowledgement and denial. Waiting, always waiting for the night the fence fails or the agreement breaks or humanity decides some secrets can't be kept forever. And on that night the world will learn what we learned, that monsters are real. They've always been real. And we've been living beside them, separated by nothing more than mutual agreement and fence that couldn't hold them if they really wanted through. The word is werewolf. The reality is worse than the word suggests. And they're still out there in the restricted zones we're told never to enter. If you made it through this account, you understand why some truths stay classified. This was inspired by real military protocols surrounding restricted wilderness zones. Or was it? Subscribe to The World Behind Midnight for more encounters with what hides in darkness. The next story waits where the light ends.